Hello everyone, and welcome to the Generic Anime Review Show. This is the show where I'm going to create my anime list. For episode 1, we are going to cover the comedy ecchi show, Punchline. This is a very stupid, fun show that far too few people have seen, which is why I'm covering it. First, a basic synopsis. Any information in here comes from the first few minutes of the first episode, so you don't need to worry about spoilers. Punchline begins with our main character Yuta sitting on a bus when suddenly 2 terrorists get on and hijack the bus. Luckily for him, the superheroine Strange Juice shows up and beats one of the 2 terrorists. The other one is able to overpower her, and hope looks lost, until Yuta accidentally sees Strange Juice's panties, which somehow gives him a burst of power, and he defeats the terrorist, before falling unconscious. When he wakes up, Strange Juice is there, and he sees her panties again. This causes him to rocket out of his body as he turns into a spirit that ends up floating above Earth, talking to a ghost cat. I'm now going to go on to a spoiler-heavy summary. And while I think it is important to go over this summary for someone who has seen the show before, as a reminder, if you haven't seen the show before, you should definitely skip to this timestamp. Alright, so spoiler time. What happens in this show? I will tell you now, even though I am going into all the twists of this show and telling what happens, I'm not going to go super in detail and tell you why it happens or when it happens, because I do think you should still see the show, and this is not a summary of the show video, it's a review of the show video. Go. After Yuta turns into a ghost, he wants to find a way back into his body. He explores his house, and he learns things about his housemates. One of them is the superheroine Strange Juice. One of them actually turns out to be a super advanced cyborg robot that helps Strange Juice in her super heroing. One of them is a NEET, which he knew already, and one of them is an actual psychic, who he uses to communicate to his friends, even though they are all very confused when he does it, because they don't know it's him. The reason they don't know he's a ghost is because his body is still alive, doing something, somewhere. You don't really learn that until later in the show. See, there's another person that's living at this house who hadn't lived there before, and it's a superhero who's very mysterious and masked. Eventually we learn that it's Yuta's body. So, there's a group of terrorists targeting the house because of Strange Juice living there. This group of terrorists is planning on blowing up the world by disrupting a satellite, knocking a meteor into it. Which is when we learn that Yuta's arousal isn't causing the world to explode, it's causing him to go forward in time, where he sees the world exploding. So now he has 3 goals. He needs to get back into his own body, he needs to stop the terrorists, and needs to figure out what's going on. We, throughout, learn parts of Yuta's backstory. He, Strange Juice, and one of the terrorists were all given superpowers by experiments done on them when they were children. These powers are called uberfications, and they uberfy when they use them. As the mystery develops, something happens. The terrorists actually win. This is on episode 6. So the masked superhero reveals himself to Yuta, saying that he is Yuta from the future, and that Yuta, the ghost, needs to go back in time to before any of this happens, knocking himself out of his body in order to stop the events. This is the first, kind of confusing event, and it does keep on being confusing, but it makes sense when you're watching the show. So then Yuta assumes the role of the superhero, and he sets off a chain of events that lead to the terrorist army attacking the house and a climactic battle involving the US Army, giant mecha suits, and superpowers. And the show ends with Yuta dying, in what I can say is an honestly emotional scene. But this plot isn't even what makes this show one of my favorites. No, it's the backstory that is what I think this makes this show amazing. Because a lot of it, it's all very well written, but a lot of it doesn't make any sense at all. The three people with superpowers have all switched bodies with each other. I mean, the backstory leading to this happening is amazingly heartfelt and very well written, with emotions, but the superpowers just don't make sense. And I can say it's the fault of bad writing. I still can't help but enjoy it. I love the backstory part of the show more than anything. The characters are all very well written, in fact. They all act very realistically, and they all have backstories that we get to learn. And I think this is a very good part about the show that does overshadow the actual plot a little bit, but that does have to do with the plot being confusing. I'll let you know what the show's about and what happens in it. How good is it? From a purely enjoyment level, I would give this show a 10 out of 10. However, that's a bad basis for ranking things. There are good and bad things about the show, objectively. The reason I can say that is because the show tries to accomplish three things. It tries to have good comedy, a good story, good emotional backbone, and good animation. To judge the show as a whole, I need to judge how it does at each of these things. To start with the easiest one, is the animation good? Yeah, it's very nice. It's generic, especially for the time and genre of this anime, but it looks nice, and it's very fluid. Next, the comedy. I do believe that good comedy is subjective. However, I don't think that the jokes in this show are the greatest. There are some very funny things. Any scene with the ghost cat is hilarious. But a lot of the jokes follow the same setup and punchline that you would see in any other ecchi show of the time. I do enjoy the way it's done though, and I don't think it does it badly. It's just sort of generic. The way the jokes come into the story is kind of annoying. See, there are two stories at the same time in the first 6 episodes. After the first 6 episodes, the jokes and the comedy lessens and the plot takes over, so it doesn't really affect that part of the story. But in the first 6 episodes, we have Yuta, who's trying to solve the mystery, and we have kind of a slice of life thing going on with all the other characters. Now, these are both written really well. However, Yuta's thing is a mystery, and it isn't dark, it's all very lighthearted, but it's a very different tone than a slice of life show. So when we cut from Yuta going, hey, what's going on, to using the second episode as an example for a specific happening, and we cut from that to, a pet bear, I want to keep it, and the housemate's telling her, no, you can't keep it. That's not good pacing. It is important to note that all the comedic elements, like that bear, become important to the plot. However, it is still quite annoying when it happens. Overall, and I may be being a little bit nice here, I'd give the comedy a 6 out of 10. Next thing to talk about is how good the plot is. And like I've said, I enjoy the plot and I think it's very well done. However, there are good things and there are bad things. To start with the good things, I think all of the characters have well-written backstories that affect how they act, and I think the way we learn about these backstories is very nicely done. The characters already know their past, so they don't naturally reminisce. We learn about it from when they tell other characters. This is a little bit annoying because the characters know things that the audience doesn't, especially because in a mystery, that is kind of like, we don't have all the clues. However, it isn't necessarily bad. Another positive, again with the characters, is just that they all act human. Their personalities aren't realistic, but they do act following them. They act in character, and this makes for fun dynamics and very nice character scenes, which we have multiple of that are fun to watch. Finally, as a good point, is the plot overall. I think that it's a fun story with a good premise, and that though there's a lot of stuff unexplained, you don't exactly need to know why it happens, just that it happens. The negatives. I think there are two main issues with this show. The first issue is that the pacing is very strange. For the first 6 episodes, although they try and focus on the plot and the character development, it's very character development heavy. And for the second 6 episodes, it's very plot heavy. I think both of these elements are good, but the way they mix them together doesn't work exactly, like I talked about in the jokes section. It's the same issue as that. Now, there are 2 ways they could have fixed this. They could have removed character development, which I personally wouldn't have liked because I like all the characters. Or a solution that wouldn't have happened, but it would have been nice, would have been to have 2 seasons. That way they could have focused on both elements more in detail. That wouldn't have happened, though. The second issue is that the unexplained stuff is always pertaining to very important plot things. Now, we don't need to know any of the super important details, but it would be nice because when something happens integral to the story, it's nice to know that it's not just a deus ex machina. I think that the story elements of the show get a 7 out of 10. The emotional backbone. I think it's presented pretty well. I don't really have much to say about this part of the show that I haven't covered already. It suffers the same pacing issues as the rest of it. And the biggest issue with the emotional backbone is that the finale is the least emotional part of it. Like, I could connect to all the characters throughout it. Their backstories made me feel for them and connect to them. And then we get to the finale, where something big happens that is supposed to make you feel, and it just didn't do it for me. And another negative is just that there's way more emotion in the first half than in the second half, and that's because the characters are developed more in the first half than in the second half, and the second half is almost entirely action and stuff. So I'd give the emotional part a 7 or a 7.5 out of 10. And clearly that leaves my final rating as a 7 out of 10. Again, this is only technically, just like how The Room is very, very bad and still gets a 10 out of 10 in enjoyment, this show is pretty good and still gets a 10 out of 10 in enjoyment. I would definitely recommend you watch it. It's a fun ecchi, not even really ecchi, it's barely ecchi, with well-made characters, less well-made jokes, and a fun plot that drags in some places. Next week, a worse, and maybe somehow weirder show. Message. Thanks anyone who watched. I'd appreciate if you liked and subscribed, although I'm just doing this for fun, and I'm not sure how good my content seems to anyone that isn't me. Clearly, I'm doing this on iMovie, and this is not very professional. If anyone wants to leave any tips in the comments, that would be greatly appreciated. Although I'm kind of bad at the tech thing, so I don't know how much I will be able to take your advice.